Okay, chapter 7. And yes, this is my dog Wookie that is joining us today, at least for a little while. I may have to take some breaks, so excuse me if I have any coughing spells in the middle of doing this, as I have strep throat. Alright, so chapter 7 is Cognition. We're going to be looking at how our mind guides our development. So we'll be looking at terms like disequilibrium and equilibration, organization, adaptation, assimilation, accommodation, terms like that. Cognition. When we look at cognition, it's basically thinking, or the activity of knowing something. Obviously, this is typical of humans throughout the lifespan, but this also includes babies. Nowadays, we don't often look at babies or even young children as rational beings, but the truth is that even young children, infants, have been shown to make moral decisions. They can do simple math. However, how we think changes across the lifespan. The two big names that we're going to be looking at are Piaget and Vygotsky, which we have covered in earlier chapters.
Hello, I am David Elkind, and I had the good fortune to study with Piaget in Switzerland at the beginning of my career. In the quarter of a century since that time, I've witnessed the way in which Piaget's teachings have become part of our way of thinking about children and how they grow and how they learn. In this film, we will highlight many of Piaget's most salient observations and conceptions.
En effet, le vrai problème de l'éducation, c'est quel est le but de l'éducation? Est-ce qu'il nous faut former des enfants et des individus qui soient simplement capables d'apprendre ce qui est déjà connu, de répéter ce qui est déjà acquis par les générations antérieures, ou bien est-ce qu'il s'agit de former des esprits novateurs, des esprits créateurs, qui soient capables d'inventer dès le niveau de l'école et ensuite pendant toute leur vie dans le domaine professionnel.
At the age of 10, he published his first scientific paper, an observation of an albino sparrow. By the time he was 16, he was so well published that he was offered, sight unseen, the curatorship of a museum. He had to turn down the offer, however, as he hadn't yet completed high school. It is the idea that our knowledge about the world grows in stages which parallel our mental growth that makes Piaget's a truly genetic epistemology. The first 2 years of life make up the sensorimotor period. And I'm going to put them under here. Watch me. Okay? She wants them and she'd disappear, but she doesn't think to look under the cloth. Yes, that's too bad. Okay. Here they are. See? Okay. Bridget, do you know your right hand and your left hand?
No?
No?
This is my right one.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my left one.
Very good. And can you tell me my left and my right?
This is your left and this is your right.
Okay, and show me your right and your left again.
My left and my right.
Okay, very good. As in the first stage of his work, Piaget was able to create tasks that other researchers could use to reveal the great discrepancy between the way in which infants and older children and adults view the world. Where's yours? And where's mine? Now, do we both have the same to drink, or does one of us have more?
I do.
But isn't this higher than this one? I mean, this is up here, and this is way down here. Doesn't that make this one more?
Well, this one may be taller, but this one is more spaced out.
Okay. The third stage Piaget called concrete operational, and it emerges between the ages of 6 or 7 and lasts until the ages of 11 or 12. Beginning at about the age of 11 or 12, the adolescent period, young people move into the stage of formal operations. During the last phase of his work, approximately the last 2 decades before his death in 1980, at age 84, Piaget dealt with a number of different issues like memory and imagery. It will be the next century before we fully realize the magnificent legacy of Jean Piaget. We hope that this film and other films in this series will enable us to realize this legacy.
Sorry. All right, so Piaget. Piaget really worked in the area of genetic epistemology, which is how we get to know reality. So Piaget wanted to see, how is it that we discover the world around us? How do children know the world and come to know the world and come to gain their experiences? He believed that children had a basic genetic foundation of their intelligence, but everything else was built through environmental impact. Piaget was employed at the Binet Institute, which you may remember from the Theodore, the Binet and Simon IQ tests, which eventually became the Stanford Binet, and he worked on developing the IQ test for France. He basically became intrigued with the reasons children gave for their wrong answers on questions that required logical thinking. He believed that incorrect answers revealed a lot more information than about the differences between the thinking of adults and children. He was the first psychologist to really systematically study the development of thinking, or cognitive development. He came up with an entire theory of how children develop their thinking. He came up with this interesting methodology of how children answer questions, and these really simple but ingenious tests on how kids think. Before Piaget's work, the common assumption in psychology was that children are just less competent thinkers than adults, but Piaget showed that children actually think differently than adults do. So he came up with this series of really unique, interesting, and very simple questions of how to understand the way children look at the world and the way children gain their understanding of the world. And I'll be showing you some videos of that later too. He used these questions to discover how children reason. Piaget said intelligence was how well we adapt to the world around us. So he looked at our adaptations, things such as our schemes. So schemes are these frameworks of understanding the world.
Bypass Publishing presents Psychology in the Fast Lane, Difficult Topics Explained. Schemas, Assimilation, and Accommodation. A schema is an organized pattern of thought that establishes a mental framework that represents some aspect of the world. We develop schemas for all types of items and activities, from simple items such as a chair, a car, fish, bird, or house, to complex, like the chemical bonds between atoms or the seating in the House of Representatives. In short, we develop cognitive patterns for many things. We then use the schema we have developed as a means to compare new information against. Here's an example. You have a schema for a chair, a bed, and a sofa. The first time you see a futon, you immediately search your stored schema to see if it fits with anything you have already encountered. If it comes close, you make subtle changes to your schema to include the new item. In this example, you now have a schema of a sofa that includes the traditional characteristics along with those of a futon. So when you can add new information into an existing schema with little effort, you have experienced the cognitive process known as assimilation. When you need to store new information that conflicts with the schema you already have in place, a schema overhaul is in order. The process of accommodation involves the altering of schemas as a result of new information or new experiences, and new schemas may be developed during this process.
Piaget defined a schema as a cohesive, repeatable action sequence possessing component actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning. In more simple terms, Piaget called the schema the basic building block of intelligent behavior. is a way of organizing knowledge. It's useful to think of schemas as units of knowledge. Each structure relates to one aspect of the world: objects, actions, abstract theoretical concepts. Schemata, which is the plural of schema, can be thought of as like index cards filed in the brain. Each one tells the individual how to react to incoming information. So if you see a fluffy four-legged animal, then your schema for cat comes up, as well as dog. And then you try to break down which schema does it fit best. When Piaget talked about the development of a person's mental processes, he was referring to how there's an increase in the number and complexity of the schema or schemata that people have learned. When a child's existing schema or schemata are capable of explaining the world around them, then Piaget said they were in a state of equilibrium, or a state of cognitive mental balance. So the idea of equilibration, which we'll get to in a second, is basically that we want to be in this state of balance, this homeostasis. These schemas are really important in our cognitive development, or in the development of our mind. And he described how we develop these or acquire these schema. So these schema are linked mental representations of the world that help us to understand and respond to situations. And the assumption is that we store these representations and then apply them whenever they're needed. Piaget believed that newborn babies have a very small number of innate or genetic schemas, even before they've had much of an opportunity to experience the world. And you can often see these in the innate reflexes like suckling. These are genetically programmed. He even called that the sucking schema. So similarly, they have a grasping reflex. When you tickle their feet, their toes will move. So there's various genetic schemas that are already there. He believed we're active creators of our intelligence, that we just don't passively receive this information. We actively go out and experience the world and build these schema. So schema are the organization that children build as they grow. And because we're actively learners, we systematically combine existing schema into new and more complex ones. So we're constantly adding to our information. Adaptation is what Piaget said is the process of adjusting to the demands of the environment. Adaptation, he also called accommodation, and there's various different types of adaptation. Accommodation, assimilation, we'll go through those. Alright, so if I asked you what kind of animal this is, you might say it's a bird. Some might say that it's a lizard. Most of you have probably never seen this animal before, and so it would be hard for you to decide exactly what this is. What you're doing is the process of adaptation. You're either assimilating, where you're using existing schemes to interpret new experiences. So you know that birds are things that fly, so you look and see, is this something that flies? If this does not fit a scheme that you already have, then you accommodate that information. So for example, butterflies fly, but they're different than birds. So even though they both fly, now you have to accommodate the information that although some things fly, they're not all birds. So if I show you some more examples of this, it has a nest and babies, it has wings, and it does fly, then you might say it's a bird, which you'd be correct. If I showed you this, now you might be really confused. Is it a mammal? Is it a rodent of some sort? It's actually a bird. This is a kiwi. It does not fly, and it does not have normal feathers. It has a very different appearance than typical. So now, instead of assimilating this to a scheme that you already have, you have to accommodate the scheme that you currently have about birds. unless you are from New Zealand and you already know what a Kiwi is. Equilibration, we've talked about this. Equilibration is the process that drives our development. Piaget didn't believe that cognitive development progressed at a steady rate, but it progressed in leaps and bounds. Equilibrium, which is the goal, occurs when a child's schemas can deal with most of the new information that's coming in through assimilation. So you get new information, it makes sense to you, you can assimilate that into the current schemes that you have. However, disequilibrium, which is an unpleasant state, occurs when you have this new information and it doesn't fit what you already know. You can't assimilate it. You have to accommodate it, and that's much more uncomfortable. So equilibration is the force that drives the learning process, because we don't want to be frustrated. We like to be balanced, and so we seek that balance. We want to restore that balance by mastering the new challenge or the new information, and that's what we call accommodation. Alright, so Piaget said adaptation is adjusting to the new environment, in which you use assimilation and accommodation in order to do that. And of course he equated intelligence with adaptation. Piaget was also a big believer in the idea of constructivism, where we construct our own reality. So we use our own experiences to understand things. Many times, because accommodation is difficult and frustrating, we don't want to accommodate, and so we ignore that information. And so we're very active in how we see our own reality. We're not passive, and reality is always filtered through our own perceptions. Alright, so in the stages of development, we went over this in an earlier chapter, but we'll go over it again. We have sensorimotor, preoperational, concrete operations, and formal operations. There's also a post-formal operations, but then we're talking about the later college and graduate school years, so we won't get into that yet. Piaget said this is an invariant sequence, which means it does not vary. We go through this in the same order. No matter where in the world or the universe you are, you will go through these stages. Now, how fast you go through them varies. You have to develop or mature biologically appropriately, so if there's mental retardation, car accident, something like that, then it may stop these changes, but a normal person will go through these stages. And it also requires experience. So if you were dropped off in a jungle and you were raised by a panther and a bear, then you're not going to get normal, healthy human experiences, and it may stop the progression through these stages. One important thing to note is that while there are age ranges associated with this, Piaget never specified that we go through these stages at a certain age. He believed it was very important to recognize that each person is different, each person goes through the stages differently, and we need to accept that children develop as children develop. It's a biological unfolding of intellectual capacity, and we can't hurry these along, which is what people, especially Americans, Western Europeans, really try to do. We try to hurry our kids through these stages, and that doesn't do them any good, and as a matter of fact, it's been associated with a lot of negative consequences, such as a dislike of learning. Alright, so we're going to look at what are the major achievements of the different stages. In particular, we'll do sensorimotor first, since that comes first, and how do infants progress towards achievement of these stages. Sensorimotor is the first stage. Sensorimotor is where newborns are using their reflexes to understand the world. They touch, they taste. Sorry. They're using their senses as well as their motor abilities. So that would be taste, touch, smell, as well as movement. So playing with things, hitting things, moving things. The outcome of the stage that you want the child to achieve is mental representation and symbolic capacity. So mental representation is the idea that I can represent something mentally in a symbolic way in my brain. So I can think of a dog, and I can understand that that picture in my head represents the real thing. The evidence of this is something we call object permanence, and I'll be showing you a video of object permanence. But it's the idea that something continues to exist even though you don't see it anymore. Symbolic capacity is the idea to symbolize one thing with something else. So it's very similar to mental representation. But it's like language, and that's the evidence for this. The word dog does not mean dog. It's simply a symbol of dog. And every language has their own version of dog. In French, it's chien. So, yeah, I was thinking that was cat, but no, it's dog. Chat is cat. So we symbolize these real existing things using language, using sounds, that in and of itself they don't mean anything. But the sensorimotor stage helps children to develop this symbolic language capacity. Alright, so sensorimotor stage, the basic summary is that infants are solving problems through their actions rather than with their minds. During the first month, infants are reacting reflexively, so it's all about their basic biological instincts. They're not thinking things through very much. It's all reaction to what's internal as well as what's external. Now, in the sensorimotor stage, we have substages. So you have primary circular reaction, secondary circular reaction, and tertiary circular reaction. In the primary circular substage, which is about 1 to 4 months, babies are very internal. It's all about their own body. They're putting their fingers in their mouth. They're sucking their thumb, sucking their toys. They are sucking their toes. They don't really care about toys. They find moving their fingers in front of their face very entertaining. They're just getting to understand their own body and what their body can do. And he called it circular because he observed that the infants will do the same things over and over and over and over again, so it's very circular. Infants get their pleasure by performing the same action over and over again, which is very similar to Freud's idea of his psychosexual stages. Although Piaget didn't say this was sexual pleasure, it kind of meant the same thing in Freud's idea. Okay, so now in the secondary circular stage, the reactions are, or the interactions are with the environment rather than just with the baby. So they're putting things in their mouth, they're banging, they're sucking on a toy or banging a toy against something. In the, sorry, let me go back. In this stage, the infants are often combining their actions in order to achieve goals. So they might push an object out of the way, trying to get to a desired object. In the tertiary stage, the tertiary circular reaction, this is 12 to 18 months, infants start to experiment. So they start to do various things with their toys. They push things off the table. They learn about the properties of the physical world around them. And they're interested in novelty just because it's interesting to them. This is also when we get the beginning of thought. So children are thinking. By a year old, children are definitely thinking. 6 months old, most people will agree that children are really starting to think. And this is all in your book. You can see the book says 1.5 years, and that's when you start seeing problem solving for the beginning of thought. Birth to 1 month, you have reflex activity. 1 to 4 months, primary circular reaction. 4 to 8 months is secondary. 8 to 12 months is when you're coordinating the secondary schemes, so you start getting, or coordination of secondary schemes. You start seeing some basic problem solving, They're combining actions, moving things aside in order to get to something they want. You see the first evidence of intentionality. Tertiary circular action, 12 to 18 months. This is when you see even better experimentation, trying to figure things out, understand the world around them. And this is usually when they say is the beginning of thought, because this is when they really start to show symbolism and understand language. However, one criticism of Piaget is that he underestimated children, and at this age is probably the beginning of thought should be a lot younger than what Piaget says it is. Sorry, you guys are killing me here. All right, object permanence. We talked about object permanence and how the idea is that you know things exist even when they're out of sight. Around 4 to 8 months, you start seeing the whole out of sight, out of mind thing. Things actually disappear when they've disappeared, which is why peekaboo is so entertaining with little kids. Okay, so you can see in this video how
What do you have there?
the child is not aware that the object
yummy
is
giraffe.
staying. Once it disappears, it's gone. So out of sight, out of mind.
Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Where's that giraffe? Okay. You ready? There he is. Very good, Jenna. There he is. There he is. There he is.
In this next video, the A not B error, this child has learned object permanence, so you see that she hides the object under the same cloth over and over again. Then when she hides it under a new cloth, although the child understands the object still exists, she assumes that the object will be under the same cloth, it will be hidden in the same spot as before. This is called the A not B error, and it's made in the sensorimotor stage.
Where is it? Oh, there he is. There he is.
In the second stage, the preoperational stage, this is when you have egocentric thinkers. So they're very much centered on themselves, and not in that they're selfish, although that's probably part of it, but that they have a hard time taking other people's perspectives. And it's really perspective taking, the ability to see that other people see things differently than you do, that helps to create compassion. They are often very much involved in fantasy play, role-playing, pretend play. They can start to use past tense words, so words that refer to the past rather than the present. Their problem solving is very limited, but they are able to do that some way, particularly with classification and seriation, so classifying things into categories like mammals or fish or dinosaurs, or seriation problem like line up from shortest to tallest. It's a series. This is with ages 2 to 7, which is basically preschool. Imaginary companions, very typical during this time period. If you have a 2 to 7-year-old with an imaginary friend, that is absolutely not something to worry about. If you have a 14-year-old with an imaginary friend, that is something to worry about. children lack conservation, which is the ability to understand that if you change the shape of something, then it does not necessarily change how much of that thing there exists, and I'll show you a video of that, so don't freak out yet. And then perceptual salience is understanding the most obvious feature of an item. So preoperational thinkers do have perceptual salience, and this often interferes with their conservation. So let me show you some conservation tasks right now.
New babies aren't quite sure what happens to objects when they leave their sight. Sky's mom keeps disappearing and reappearing. No wonder peekaboo is so much fun. During their first year, however, infants will learn an important concept: object permanence. Everything has a life of its own, even if it is out of sight.
At Maya's age, babies know to look for the object, but they might not have everything else straight. 10-month-old Simon is about to make a classic mistake. Although he watched us place the toy plane under the white cloth, he'll look for it where he last found it, not where he watched us hide it.
Can you look at these two glasses? Do you think that they have the same amount of juice? You think they have the same? Okay. Now we're going to pour this juice into this glass. Now, do you think that this glass has more juice, this glass has more juice, or do you think that they have the same amount?
That one has more.
This one has more, and why do you think that this one has more?
Because it's taller.
Okay, you ready? Yeah. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or do they have the same?
1, 2, 3. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're both the same.
They're the same?
5, 5.
Okay. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more, or do they have the same?
This one has more.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does this row have more quarters?
Because it's more far away.
It's more far away?
Yeah, it's more far away than that. Looks like bigger.
All right, we're going to play a game with the graham crackers, and we're going to share them between me and you, okay? Okay. Do you think that we shared those fairly?
No.
No, why not?
You have those and I have this one.
Well, what if we try this? Okay, can I put this down right there?
Okay.
Now is it fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, why is it fair now?
Because we both have two.
Can you tell me what you see when you look at that from where you're sitting? What are some of the things that you see?
And a cat.
A cat.
And a tree and a bone.
Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. Can you tell me what you see when you look at it from that story?
Now you see with this little boy that he's showing the egocentrism. That he can't see how the woman sees things differently than he does. He just believes that she will see everything exactly how he does, and he can't even understand the concept of her seeing things differently than him.
And can you tell me what I see when I look at this from where I'm sitting right here?
An owl.
Okay.
And a goat.
Mm-hmm.
And a little tree. And that. And that.
Now, one of the main reasons this happens is that during this age group, toddlers, preschool age kids have what's called static thought, which is where they're fixed on the end stages of the object rather than the metamorphosis before. So like when you pour a glass of water into another glass of water, they can't think through that middle process. They can only think of the end states. Irreversible thinking is where when one thing changes into something else, it can't change back. So they have a hard time kind of going back and forth between the two things. We also have something I didn't mention on the PowerPoint called decentration, which is where kids have the inability to think about more than one aspect of the object at a time. So the quarters are spaced out wider, it looks bigger, so they focus on that part, but they can't also focus on, well, how many quarters are there. That's called decentration. Alright, and this is just some of the tests that PJ used. You can look through that in your book. So that was pre-operational. Now we're moving into concrete operational. So if you want to compare the two, this is a great chart. Alright, so what's going on in concrete operational? So this is ages 7 to 11, so early elementary school. Kids can conserve at this point. They are showing, I'm sorry, the pre-operational shows centration. Concrete operational is able to decentrate. So they're able to think about more than one aspect of an object at a time, whereas the younger kids can't. They're also able to do reversible thinking. Well, if I change it into this, it can also change into the other thing. And they're much more logical in their thinking, although this is limited to reality. So the idea of thinking hypothetically about something that doesn't exist is not their cup of tea. They're also continually able to do the seriation and classification, so line things up in a series, classify it into categories. And they're able to do transitive thinking, which is if this exists and this exists, then what about this? So the example here, if J is taller than M and M is taller than S, then who is taller, J or S? That's actually pretty complex, a complex thought process for a kid.
So first we're going to look at these two cups right here. Do you think there's the same amount of juice in this glass as there is in that glass?
They're even.
They're even? Okay. So we're going to take the juice from this glass and pour it into this one right here.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to look at this glass and that one. So do you think that there's more juice in this glass, more juice in this glass, or do you think that they have the same amount?
Same amount.
Okay, why do you think that they have the same amount?
Just because this is skinny doesn't mean it's not the same amount. It has the same amount of juice in it, but this one is just wider and this one's skinnier, but they have the same amount of juice in it.
It says, if you hit a glass with a hammer, the glass will break.
I knew that.
And then this one says, Dawn hit a glass with a hammer.
I knew that too.
So what happened to the glass?
It broke.
It broke. Why did it break?
Because the hammer's hard.
If you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break.
No, it won't.
And this is the second rule. Dawn hit a glass with a feather. What happened to the glass?
Nothing.
Nothing happened? Why didn't anything happen?
Because the feather was soft.
If you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break.
Okay.
And the second one, Dawn hit a glass with a feather. What happened to the glass?
It broke.
And why did it break?
Because the rule says if you hit a glass with a feather, it'll break. So if you hit a glass with a feather, it broke.
Okay, now we're getting into formal operation. So this is where you're into teenage years, you're able to start thinking abstractly. You can think logically about hypothetical and abstract thinking, even if it doesn't make sense, like the feather question. They're able to think, basically it's the idea that we can have ideas about realities that don't exist. Okay. We can deal with possibilities, we can deal with things that contradict reality. We can think hypothetically or deductively, scientific process, reasoning, reasoning skills that are important to science, and everything in life, really. This is sort of the detective work. We're able to get clues, all these separate objects, put them together, deduce from it. We're also able to do decontextual thinking. So we might say, okay, well, we know such and such exists, but let's separate ourselves from this and think about this in a different way. So let's say if you're religious, if you're a Christian, you can say, okay, so I was raised to believe all this stuff, but let's put that aside and let's think about this, you know, logically, coldly, without our prior beliefs. It's difficult, but it's a skill that we're able to do in formal operations. And if we're trained to do it well, then we can become really good at it. In my family, for instance, although we were raised within a religious belief, my parents thought it was really important for us to be able to question that, to look at other beliefs, and to come up with our own, make our own decisions regarding it. So we were really taught to decontextualize. It was a skill that was developed in our family. We also have a different form of egocentrism, which is just like with the little kids, it's difficult to differentiate our own thoughts from others. So we know that they have a different perspective, but we often think their perspective on us personally is the same as how we see it. So we have what's called an imaginary audience, where we think people are watching us, we think people care more than they do because we care so much at that age, and it's difficult to separate ourselves from that. We also have what's called a personal fable at this age, which is where we believe that our life is so unique to others that nobody has experienced what we've gone through, and we are able to do things differently than everyone else. And this is mostly all chalked up to a lack of experience, which is of course central to Piaget's theory on the development of intelligence. You need experience in life in order to develop your mind. So the longer we live, the more we realize nobody cares about us. I mean, not like your family and friends don't care about you, but the world at large could care less that you exist. And then also the fact that nobody else has been through this before, we eventually realize everybody has been through it and had a very similar experience. So what does it require to get through this formal operations successfully? It requires normal intelligence. It also requires formal education. Particularly a bachelor's degree is helpful. High school starts it, going on to a bachelor's completes it. It's required because it really fosters a certain type of thinking that you don't get in regular everyday experiences. It can happen. Certain tribes are really good at pushing for this type of intelligence, but it doesn't always happen. It usually doesn't happen without formal education. Now, like most types of intelligence, formal operational thinking can be broken down into different areas. On the formal operational thinking tests, they have a pendulum problem that requires physics, a political problem, a literary problem, and people did better in the type of thinking that they specialized in school, which makes sense. So if you were a physics major, you did better with the pendulum problem. If you were a political major, you did better with the political problem. If you were an English major, you did better with the literary problem, which makes sense. So formal operational thought is dependent on our training, and whatever we're trained in, we do better in that type of formal thought. Post-formal thought is optional. So here's a question for you. A grows 1 centimeter per month. B grows 2 centimeters per month. Who is taller? Now, Those of you who got this correct will be flabbergasted. You'll be astonished. But a lot of people answer B, that B grows 2 centimeters per month. And if you answered that, that's okay. You just have to continue your education. The answer is, you can't say the answer because there's not enough information. What did A start out as? What did B start out as? Just because B is growing taller per month does not mean that that B is taller than A, because B could have started a lot shorter. So post-formal thought is this ability to go beyond the abstract. It's the ability to look at contrary and contradictory ideas and bring them together, or even hold two opposing ideas that can't be brought together and still somehow be able to work with them. Here's another question. John is known to be a heavy drinker, especially when he goes to parties. Mary, John's wife, warns him that if he gets drunk one more time, she will leave him and take the children. Tonight, John is out late at an office party. He comes home drunk. Does Mary leave John? Alright, so if you're in post-formal thought, and even slightly formal operational thinking, hopefully, because you should be headed to post-formal, the answer is you don't know, because things are complicated. Just because she says that she'll leave does not mean that she's actually going to. Maybe something happens, maybe she's just not strong enough, whatever. So there's all sorts of other factors that can come into play. And the farther you are into post-formal thinking, the easier it is for you to bring those other variables to mind to understand that situations are complicated and not straightforward. So this is the highest level of thought. It's where we get what's called relativistic thinking. So you think relative to the situation. Just because I would do something doesn't mean somebody else did. Just because these are the rules that were given does not necessarily mean these are the rules that are following. Everything is relative. What somebody's going to do in one culture, they may not do in another culture. You also are no longer absolutist, which is often what you see in the earlier levels of thinking. There's no absolute answer in many situations. Sometimes there are, most of the time there aren't. Post-formal thought often comes with graduate school level training, master's, doctorate. All right, progression to post-formal thought. Trying to see if there's anything here that we haven't talked about. All right, so we talked about being an absolutist, being a relativist. Post-formal thinkers are also not strongly committed to their position. So, for example, let's use the religion example again. Sorry, my throat's just about giving out on me. So I was raised Christian. I believe everything about Christianity. However, even though I am firmly committed to my beliefs, because I'm in post-formal thought, I'm also willing at any moment to challenge that belief and to rethink it. So post-formal thinkers are not strongly committed to their position, although they may feel strongly about their position. They're not going to stay in it no matter what, which is often what you see in the lower levels of thinking. They also thrive on paradoxes and challenges. They want to be challenged. They want things that don't make sense. They love things that contradict each other, that make them think. Alright, so here's the basic breakdown. Concrete operationals look at objects. Formal operationals look at ideas, and post-formal look at systems of ideas. Oops, sorry. Okay, so post-formal occurs in a very small minority of adults. People with PhDs are 0.01% of the population, so it's very rare. Mostly in those with advanced education, although it does not necessarily require that. It's just easiest to get post-formal when you have advanced education. It happens in those who are open to rethinking issues. You can even have PhDs who do not have post-formal thinking because they're very stuck in their ways for whatever reason. And it also happens mostly in cultures that nourish new ideas. So you will not see this in North Korea. If it happens, it's going to be extremely rare. Whereas in America, we're very pro new ideas. And even though we can often lash out against people who don't agree with our beliefs, like, for instance, try posting on Facebook that you hate homosexuals and see what happens, okay? We're still very open to it. You may post that and you may lose a lot of friends, but you're not going to get put in prison and tortured and executed for posting an idea like that. Whereas in North Korea, if you post that you hate the supreme leader, okay, that is going to happen. So Piaget says that age is not nearly as important as what's going on in your life and the environment. How demanding is the person's environment? Now, unfortunately, a lot of people took this from Piaget to mean that if you give your child a very stimulating lifestyle, then they are going to be advanced intellectually. That's not true. No matter how demanding the environment is, you can't stimulate a child past their physical abilities. However, within the age range that they are, a demanding environment can advance a person's cognitive abilities. However, this does not mean that you play Baby Einstein on TV for them. It means that their life is being challenged, they're being stressed, they're having to figure out problems and new solutions and learn how to be independent, and they have freedom, they play outside. These are things that our society does not give kids. So we think putting them down in front of the TV and watching these advanced shows is going to make them smarter, when really it's kicking their butt outside and making them go play that will make them smarter, letting them deal with stresses instead of coddling them. So we have actually had an opposite reaction to Piaget's teachings than what he meant. We are doing the opposite, which means that we're actually delaying our children's cognitive abilities by how we're trying to advance them.